For decades, the dollar has been by far the most dominant currency in global trade. Having control over the world's currency of choice has been a huge advantage for America, and that's an understatement. But is the world now going through the long-predicted process of de-dollarization? Welcome to the program. I'm Philip Hampshire. The main threat to the dominance of the dollar comes from China's currency, the yuan. Payments for oil and gas between countries have been done via the dollar for the best part of a century, even when America is not directly involved. However, China is now cutting deals to do huge energy trades in the yuan with places like Brazil, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and Argentina. Tellingly, even some French firms are settling gas deals in yuan. So, what's driving this process and what might be the consequences? Joining me to discuss this in the studio, I have Wolfgang Mungchau, who is a Director of Euro Intelligence and News Service concentrating on the European Union. Meanwhile, in Singapore, we're joined by Kaya Pav, who is a Partner and Chief Investment Officer at CreditLink AI. And in Vienna, in Austria, Ralf Schollhammer, who is Assistant Professor at Webster University and Hilltower Resource Advisors. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Wolfgang. If I start with you, the US dollar, people have been talking about it for 50 years and talking about the concept of de-dollarization. Is it finally happening? And in your opinion, why, if it is?
Well, thank you for having me here. People have been talking for 50 years. I've been talking about this for 25 years. And 25 years ago, I predicted it would happen, and I was absolutely wrong. So you've got to be very careful about what I'm going to say here today. But it's probably worth reflecting on why, I and several other people who looked at the euro at the time as a potential challenger to the dollar, and that didn't happen. Why we got it wrong, and because something intervened that we didn't see. China adopted a new kind of economic model, and globalization, the type of globalization that we've been experiencing in the last 30 years, really took on an awful lot of force. It was, what I call one world globalization. It was basically everyone together, the BRICS, the five, the tiger economies, Brazil, Russia, back then, China, India, and South Africa were all seen to be sort of the new, the new engine of world economic growth. They all ran large surpluses, trade surpluses, and that has been a factor in cementing the dollar's role, because the United States became it absorbed those surpluses into its own financial system. And this has strengthened the role of the US dollar.
So why do you think it might be over now?
It's geopolitics. What I think is this is why we can't really discuss the question about the future of the dollar like in a 34 to 40-year perspective, because it depends on the other factors. In my view. And there is something happening in geopolitics right now, which some people call it bifurcation or fragmentation. But there is a serious danger of United States and China splitting up over trade, splitting up over finance. We see the US much more willing to impose economic sanctions. That's happened on Russia, of course, but also on China. We've seen the ban on semiconductor sales, the ban on Huawei. More bans are on the cards. Should there ever be a conflict over Taiwan, the US-China conflict is likely to run its course. And if that happens, China and other countries may have an incentive to change their economic system. So it's not a given, but it is a conditional possibility of a shift in geopolitical events.
Now, I've got here a graph of the US dollar relative to other currencies as used as a reserve currency by central banks. Back in 1999, the US dollar made up 73% of international currency reserves at central banks. These days, it's down to 59%. It hasn't been the euro that's really taken away lots of market share from it. It's been other currencies, for which read the Chinese renminbi or yuan, if you prefer, or some of the other currencies around the world. Ralph, I'm going to come across to you next, because I know you're a great proponent of the fact that the US dollar isn't going anywhere.
Yes, I mean, what you just mentioned about the reserve currency status, international reserves, most people start as the cutoff point with 1999. But if you go back, let's say, to 1995, you see that the international reserves held in US dollars are about the same as they are in 1995. So this is not a constant decline. And I have to admit, I agree with everything that Wolfgang said. I think his assessment is 100% correct. I just come to a different conclusion. As the world becomes more insecure, as geopolitical insecurities and uncertainties start to mount, my assumption is that more people will flee into the US economic system, into the US dollar, which ultimately would probably strengthen the American currency and not the opposite. So I think his assessment is absolutely right. But the alternative, the question is, even those who could provide an alternative, do they want to? I agree with Wolfgang's assessment of the Chinese economic system, but to attempting to change it and actually being able to do so, those are two different things. And domestic demand in China is weak. Without their trade surplus system, their quasi-mercantilist economic system, they'd be in deep trouble. So I think even if they could, they wouldn't want to replace the US dollar.
So, Kaya, I'm going to come to you now. Are you going to break this deadlock? Which side are you going to fall down on?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join the program. I guess I'm sort of in between the two. As Wolfgang rightfully pointed out, the debate about de-dollarization has been ongoing for 50 years. That's just before I was even born. I would say that the recent geopolitical developments definitely have had an impact, as the US has decided to weaponize dollar increasingly. But I would say, given the amount of financial markets relying on the dollar and the US Treasury being one of the most used collateral in the financial markets, it's extremely hard to eliminate the dollar or even reduce the dependency on the dollar significant way within a short frame of time. So I think the dollar is here to stay, at least for the time being. There's definitely going to be other alternatives, be it in the form of Chinese yuan, the euro, gold, or maybe some sort of cryptocurrency, but it's a slow process.
Okay, I'm going to be a little bit flippant here, but when you say that countries will find it hard to move away from the US dollar in very short succession, Russia has had to do it almost overnight. Now, as I mentioned, in the case of Russia, there's a very specific set of reasons for that, but that kind of plays into some of the positions against the US dollar. There's been a weaponization of the SWIFT banking system. There has been a weaponization of any assets that can be held in US dollars inside the US political system or the US economy can be seized by the US state now. We now have that as a precedent. Does that not hurt the US dollar longer term, or is it a short-term blip and people will forget about it?
Well, any very quick change definitely causes friction. And I think if you ask from any Russian living in Russia right now, has it been a pleasant year for them? Or has it been even pleasant period since 2014 when they annexed Crimea? The reality is there has been a lot of friction because there has been such rapid shift from the US dollar to Chinese yuan or even Russian ruble within Russia. But again, as I said, the amount of reserves held in US dollar right now are still about 60% of total FX reserves. Moving away from that is going to be extremely difficult. And even then, if you want to move away from that, to what? Euro is not a stable currency, unfortunately, at this point. Yuan is politically influenced currency. And talk about some other major currencies, a lot of them have currency controls. So I would say, as they say, Tina, there is no other alternative.
Wolfgang, both Kaya and Ralph here raised the point that, yes, it's all very well to talk about de-dollarization and people moving their money out of US dollars, but they have to move it into something else.
Absolutely.
And right now, what is the alternative to that? It certainly isn't Bitcoin, because that's far too volatile, shrieking up and down. So is that not part of the issue here?
That is certainly part of the issue, and I also don't expect this to happen quickly. But what we should be careful with the sort of the Tina argument about things. Just because something didn't happen for 30 years or 50 years, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen now. I mean, we've had the pandemic, we've had another big land war in Europe. We are used to big shifts happening. I completely agree with you about Russia. You know, this was an example of where things happened quickly. Just take the following scenario: China invades Taiwan in 2 years. Yeah, it's not something I predict, but just hypothetical. What would happen? The US would almost surely freeze China's reserve assets, as they did with Russia. Now, Russia had about, I don't have the numbers, but $300 billion maybe $200 billion in reserve assets in dollars. China has about 3.2 or so trillion held in US dollars. That's more than 10 times as much. If that were to happen, China would take steps to reorient its economy. I completely agree that China's a mercantilist economy, and as long as China remains a mercantilist economy, it ain't gonna happen. But if there is a conflict between the US, and it doesn't have to be a military conflict, if it is just basically a diplomatic standoff with the use of economic sanctions, the incentives for China to shift its economic models would become absolutely overwhelming. It is also possible that they might do this slowly. I do know that they're holding strategy meetings in Beijing where they're actually discussing how do we reduce our dollar dependency. The Chinese don't do this over a year or two, they do this over a period of 10 to 20 years. So this might be a time frame over which this happens. And that would induce, imply policy changes. Certainly the reduction of the surplus would have to be part of it. The reduction in investment. China spends over 40% of its GDP on investment. This is more than twice on what the Americans are spending, certainly even more than what the UK is spending. If they get it to a normal sort of level, which is more like 20-25%, then Chinese consumers would spend, would have a greater portion of GDP, and a consumer would normally import things, not just, whereas investments is much more domestically generated. So there would be a rebalancing going on that would have to happen anyway. If you look at the Chinese, I'm not an expert on China, but the experts on China I read and I trust are telling me this is something that is in imbalance, this is not going to work. It can be suppressed, but over the long run, China will need to rebalance, and that will also rebalance the international flows, financial flows. But if that doesn't happen, then I agree, but,
Let me take this across to Ralph. Ralph, what do you feel about that?
No, well, let me gently push back because I'm a huge fan of Wolfgang's work. I read all his columns in the New Statesman, so I follow his work very closely. But again, I think he's absolutely right in what he's saying. But let's look, for example, at a potential conflict with China and at the geopolitical fundamentals that differentiate China and the US. The US are basically food and energy independent, which China is not. The US have a blue water navy, the Chinese have a green water navy. That even in such a conflict, I'm not entirely sure if the Chinese would be better positioned, which is why I believe that they will not invade Taiwan anytime soon. I hope I'm right on this for various reasons. Of course, I can be wrong there. And the second part is, this is how these debates at the moment very often go. It starts with the premise that we are living through the time of de-dollarization. And yes, at some point, the dollar is going to lose its dominant status. But as we dig deeper into the discussion, we very soon end up at the point to say, well, it might happen in 20 years. It might happen in 25 years. And I agree with that. But that's not imminent. So if I read a headline that says the world is turning away from the dollar, and then in the paragraph 2, it says it might happen in 20 years, that's not imminent. And that's, I think, what we have to talk about. It's possible, but that doesn't mean that it's probable. It's inevitable, but that also doesn't mean that it's imminent. And I think these are the distinctions we have to make.
Those are very important distinctions. Now, we debated quite firmly in the office which set of quotes, because I knew that this argument would come up from one of the three of you. We debated in the office which set of quotes we should pick for this, because we could have picked the recent conversations that took place between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, where they were on the stage together discussing their position. But it's fairly obvious both of those have a vested interest in moving away from the US dollar. However, I could have picked quotes from the president of Argentina. I could have picked them from MBS in Saudi Arabia. I could have picked the South African president. I've got here the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, and he had this to say: every night I ask myself why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar. Why can't we do trade based on our own currencies? Who was it that decided that the dollar was the currency after the disappearance of the gold standard? Now, that's Lula da Silva in Brazil. Meanwhile, I've got a separate quote here, which is from Saudi Arabia's finance minister, Mohammed al-Jadaan, who had this to say while he was actually having a conversation at Davos. This is right in the middle of the peak of the West's, if you like, economic power. He's in Davos and he says, "There are no issues with discussing how we settle our trade arrangements, whether it's in the US dollar, the euro, or the Saudi rial." So do both of those comments, one from Saudi Arabia, one from Brazil. As I mentioned, we could pick others from South Africa, from Argentina, from Chile. Ralph, do both of those not indicate now may be the time?
No, they don't, because the same argument that Lula made, or the same complaint was made by French President Charles de Gaulle in 1965. He said almost exactly the same thing, so this makes no difference. What politicians say and the realities of the economy are very often different. So I understand when Brazil and Argentina, when they talk about they want to get away from the dollar, but let's look at Argentina for 1 second. They are currently conducting more business in renminbi because they want to keep the dollars that they have, because they know that ultimately that's the currency they're going to need. There is plenty of debt. I think it's over 40% or there whereabouts about the international debt that is taken out in dollars. Again, I'm Austrian, right? I'm not American, so for me this is neither here nor there. But the hard numbers tell us that when push comes to shove, the dollar is the most trusted currency, and it makes sense because for all the troubles the United States currently have, also politically but also economically, they are still more transparent than other countries. China is not a transparent country. Russia is not a transparent country. So would you trust your monetary policy to these countries? And I think most countries or most investors would say no.
Kaya, what's your thoughts on that?
I actually agree with Ralph, and I recall that quote by Lula, and I think it was given in the context that perhaps BRICS countries forming their own currency union, which definitely is amusing given even euro is, arguably unsuccessful project just because each independent countries have very different economic cycles. So if you would have a shared currency within BRICS, completely different stages of development, different economic stages of each of these countries, you can't have a stable currency. So I would lean into Ralph's point that the dollar offers the stability. Despite the recent uptick in inflation, the higher rates, it's still one of the most stable currencies in the world. And if you have to put your hard-earned money into something, you would rather put it into dollar than maybe into yuan or Russian ruble, because you never know if you're going to get it back and what will be the value of that money at that point in time.
Okay, Ralph, we're going to take it in a slightly different direction. The comments from Saudi Arabia, though, do reflect an economic reality because, of course, if Saudi Arabia chooses to price some of its oil contracts in currencies that aren't US dollars, it doesn't have a direct impact on the US dollar, but it does begin the slow unwinding of the US dollar within the financial system.
Well, potentially, although I think that generally the petrodollar is overrated. But let's look at the story of Saudi Arabia. The story of Saudi Arabia's political and economic development basically was an agreement between the House of Saud and the United States. The House of Saud agreed to denominate their resources in dollars, and the United States agreed to protect Saudi Arabia, in all ways, shapes, and forms as they've done it over the last couple of years. Do you think that if Saudi Arabia moves away from the United States and kind of end up their end of the bargain, that the United States won't do the same? Of course they would, and Saudi Arabia knows that. If Saudi Arabia has problems with Iran, if they have problems in the region, if they have any security questions that need addressing, whom are they going to go to? They're going to go to the United States. They're not going to go to China. They're not going to go to Russia. And as long as these geopolitical conditions, as Wolfgang correctly pointed out, remain in place, the dollar as America's currency will remain dominant. Again, this is not because I want it to be this or because I don't want it to be like this, but I think these are in many ways the realities we have to deal with.
Wolfgang.
I think this is wishful thinking. First of all, on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is now has diplomatic relations with China. China has shown a great interest in building up relations with Saudi Arabia. There is quite a lot going on. The scenario in which a de-dollarization can happen can be very sudden. For example, the US is on the verge of default. If Congress refuses to raise the debt ceiling, which we hope it won't, but there is a non-trivial probability that it might happen.
To be fair, this problem crops up every 3 or 4 years, and the US always dodges the bullet.
It usually dodges the bullet. It always dodges the bullet, absolutely right. But this year is slightly more difficult than in previous years because the confrontational politics is worse than it was previously. Another scenario, Donald Trump gets reelected in 2024. US foreign policy shifts further towards isolationism. There are a number of things that can happen geopolitically that would divide the world into camps. And the idea is not that, Norway or, EU countries would, save their money in China, in Chinese currency. That's not going to happen. The sovereign wealth fund in Europe will always, use the dollar because that's the obvious one. The question is, if the world is sort of bifurcating into two rival camps, it is the other camp that would be using whatever that currency is. It could be the renminbi, it could be it could be something else, it could be a new currency, could be something crypto. I mean, that shouldn't be ruled out. And that's why I'm also more cautious about the timescales. Under a normal, smooth scenario, I would agree with the 20 years timescale. That's probably right, and why we should probably come back in 20 years and have that discussion again. We might have it again in 20 years. But the scenario I worry about is not the slow shift, which things shift always slowly, and then obviously many other political things will intrude, and economic things will intrude. But the scenario we have seen in the last 5 years, since starting with Brexit and Donald Trump in 2016. Extraordinary political events in our own neighborhood, in Europe, in the world. We've seen the Ukraine war, we've seen a pandemic. You don't even have to continue on this sort of crazy path to imagine this.
Well, you suddenly have a black swan moment. The Berlin Wall falls, something equivalent to that, and there's a problem, right? Let me take it across to Kaya. Kaya, central bank digital currencies. There is about to be a massive changeover sometime in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, where currencies naturally move across from paper money across to digital money. Is that not a risk in and of itself? Because it provides a natural juncture for people to look at other currencies.
Yeah, absolutely. But it depends how you're going to structure that digital reserve currency. If it's just the same currency in a digital format, it doesn't really make much of a difference. Other than the central bank or the government can target monetary stimulus in a much more effective manner. And we have seen PBOC doing that already with their digital yuan project, I think a couple of years ago. And whereby they really attempted to give stimulus in specific parts of the country and giving a duration for that particular issuance, meaning, yes, you get 100 yuan, but you have to spend it within the next 2 months, for instance. So that helps the central bank to impact a bit more the monetary policy. So in that shape or form, I don't think there would be much of a threat to the dollar, because the main characteristic of the dollar still remains its stability, its backbone as the financial collateral, and also the predictability of the policies and the politics.
Ralph, I know that you're going to agree with Kaya on a lot of that, so I'm just going to add in a slight extra spin for you that with the central bank digital currency, because the very nature of it is digital, it makes it much easier for a government to switch off your access to it. And isn't that part of the argument that we were having about de-dollarization, is that you could tie it into the fact that the US was weaponizing its SWIFT banking network at the moment?
Yeah, no, that is true. I'm very worried about these tendencies, because treasury departments and central banks could become the quasi eye of Sauron in the financial sector, right? Where they see everything, where they can measure every transaction. And as we've seen in the past, at some point you give governments the possibility to defund you or basically debank you, maybe because you hold the wrong political views. So I see certain risks there. And there can be no doubt that even Western democracies are not completely immune to these autocratic temptations. But just real quick to come back to one point that I find really important, which is ultimately, unless you're North Korea, it is not states that do the trading or the buying and the selling. Very often it is actual individuals. And go through the world and ask people, which currency apart from their own they would accept. And most people will tell you the US dollar, right? Out of the $2 trillion in dollar notes in circulation, half of them are outside the United States, and in many countries it's used more regular on a day-to-day basis than the local currencies. And because nobody wants to hold yuan, nobody wants to hold these other currencies or fictional BRICS currencies. So as in, yes, at one day the dollar dominance will end, no doubt about this. But the idea, as some propose, that as the world gets less certain, it gets more insecure. I see this as a rebound for the dollar, because you go where you think it's going to be secure. You go to the trusted source of the past. I don't think that people would say in a conflict with the US and China, now I'm going to shift all my assets into the Chinese currency. Or if we talk about Russia, nobody trusts Russia. So if you have them as part of your new currency, hypothetically or otherwise, that's not, I think, going to be a huge asset in the realm of trust.
Kaya, very quickly, last question, I'm going to throw it to you. none of the three of you, and I hesitate to mention this because none of the three of you had said it so far, so I don't want the three of you to laugh at me. What about gold? There's a gold bug sitting at home watching this program, throwing cushions at the television set at the moment going, they haven't mentioned gold. Why does nobody mention gold ever?
Strong believer in gold as well as a, let's call it a stable asset within the portfolio. Have purchased for myself, have purchased for my mom who lives in Eastern Europe, in Estonia, clearly a problematic area in the world, I would say. Definitely something to have, especially in physical form, depending on ability to store it, depending how much you can purchase it. So I think it definitely has a place in portfolio.
Okay, Kaya, Ralph, Wolfgang, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me. It was a fantastic show, a pleasure to have all three of you here with me. Remember, if you want to see more discussion and debate, head on over to our YouTube channel, search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.